The flooded land Red Willow Valley, New Mexico Territory, August 1879. The sky had torn itself open before dawn. Rain came like judgment, thick, relentless, and cold enough to brew. The river swelled beyond its banks, dragging whole branches and the memory of summer with it. Silas Walker watched from his porch, the storm reflected in his coffee tin like a trembling mirror. He'd built this cabin 6 years ago, high enough, or so he'd thought, to stay above the floodline. The valley proved him wrong that morning. If this story finds you, partner, comment 1, because what washed up that day would change everything. Lightning carved the hills. Thunder followed like the voice of an angry god. He turned toward the sound of wood splintering, his fence giving way. And then he saw it, something caught in the current, a tangle of fabric and dark hair, turning slow in the brown water. For a heartbeat he thought it was just driftwood. Then the fabric rose and fell. A body. He didn't think. The river was 50 feet off, swollen and fast, but his boots were already sinking in the mud before reason could speak. He hit the water hard, cold, biting through denim currents, spinning him sideways. The figure bumped against him, small, limp. He grabbed her wrist. Flesh, human, warm beneath the chill. By the time he dragged her onto the gravel bank, rain had flattened everything: his breath, the trees, the sound of his own pulse. She was young, maybe mid-20s. Her skin bronze under the mud, her dress torn open at the shoulder, rawhide still twisted around her wrists. Apache. Silas knelt beside her, pressing 2 fingers against her throat. Nothing. He cursed under his breath, then locked both hands over her chest. 1, 2, 3, water burst from her mouth, coughing, choking. She rolled to her side and gasped, the sound sharper than thunder. For a moment, neither moved. Just the storm and their breathing. She turned her face toward him, eyes black as wet obsidian, wild, unbroken even now. He whispered to the rain, "You're all right. You're all right, though." He wasn't sure which of them he was trying to convince. The river kept rising behind them, erasing their footprints as quickly as they formed. Breath against rain. The river would not stop speaking that night. It whispered against the walls, crawled beneath the floorboards, drummed its 1,000 fingers on the roof. Every plank of the cabin seemed to breathe with it, like the land itself was trying to steady its own pulse after nearly drowning. Silas carried the woman inside his arms, shaking from effort more than weight. She was lighter than she should have been, nothing but skin, bone, and stubborn will. Her hair clung to her face in wet ropes, black as the storm outside. When he laid her near the hearth, her head lolled to one side. Lips parted, a trace of river silt along her cheek. He struck a match, coaxed a flame out of damp kindling, cursing softly under his breath until the fire took. The smoke rose reluctant and gray, curling toward the rafters. Fire and rain met in that fragile truce between worlds. Her breathing came ragged. Mud streaked her throat, and the rawhide at her wrists had cut to blood. He found his knife, sliced the bonds. The skin beneath was swollen purple, marked with the geometry of pain. He poured whiskey into a tin cup and used the edge of a rag to clean the wounds. She flinched once, a sharp sound caught in her throat, but didn't wake. He spoke to her anyway, voice low, the way men talk to ghosts. "Storms past its peak. You made it through." The words felt foolish in the small air of the room, but silence had weight, and he couldn't bear it, pressing down. He wrapped her in his blanket, the same one that had kept him alive through winters and wars, and watched the color return to her lips. When he touched her forehead, she burned hot fever, rising, the kind that could take a soul before dawn. He mixed rainwater with willow bark, crushed it in the pestle, and forced a few sips between her lips. She swallowed by instinct. That was something. Hours passed. Rain hissed against the shutters. The smell of wet earth pushed through the cracks. Silas sat on the floor, boots off, socks soaked, hat forgotten beside him. Every now and then he glanced toward the door, half expecting the men who had left her in the river to come finish what they started. The storm made him remember another. A different cabin, another woman, Mary. He had been gone then, riding with the cavalry, chasing ghosts of orders through Arizona dust, while his wife coughed herself hollow. He'd missed her last breath by 2 days. Now every storm sounded like her calling his name through the dark. A sound broke his thoughts, soft, broken. Ayanna stirred. A small cry slipped from her half-word. half paying. Silas leaned forward. "You're safe," he said, though both knew safety was a word that didn't hold out here. Her eyes opened slow as dawn through fog. They fixed on him first, then the fire, then the walls. She tried to move, failed. He caught her shoulders gently. "Easy," he murmured. She rasped something in Apache, 2 syllables, raw and short. He didn't catch them, but the tone was a prayer. He recognized that sound. Soldiers had mocked it once before battle. He had never joined in the laughter. "I don't mean you harm," he said. "You fell in the river. I pulled you out." She studied him with the clarity of someone who had learned the price of trust. Her eyes, though dulled by fever, were fierce. No fear, no belief, just the measuring gaze of a survivor. "Water," she whispered, voice cracked. He filled a tin cup and held it out. She tried to lift her hands, but they trembled too much. He guided the cup carefully. The metal touched her lips, and she drank in small, greedy swallows. When she finished, her breath shook. He saw the bruises at her jawline, the cuts on her knuckles, signs of struggle, not surrender. "River?" she asked after a moment. "Still rising," he said. She turned her head toward the sound outside, the endless murmur of floodwater rushing past the walls. Her lips moved like she wanted to speak again, but no words came. Silas added another log to the fire. The room glowed amber, softening her features. In the light, she looked younger, but her face carried the exhaustion of someone twice her age. He sat back against the wall, watching her breathe. The rain's rhythm steadied, fell into a kind of lullaby. Between each drop the world seemed to stretch and exhale. He must have drifted for a while, because when he blinked again, the fire had burned down to coals. She was awake. Her eyes were open, reflecting the dull orange light. She was staring at him. "Why?" she said suddenly. The word was simple, fragile, like she'd had to break it free from stone. He hesitated. "Because no one else would," he answered. She studied him again, longer this time. Then, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders eased. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, as if that small answer, foolish as it was, had built a bridge she hadn't expected to find. He wanted to ask who had done this to her, who had tied her wrists and thrown her into the river. But questions were like blades, pull one wrong, and everything bled. He stayed silent. Her eyes drifted to the shelf above the hearth, where an old cavalry medal hung on a nail beside a cracked Bible. She looked at it, then back to him. Her mouth tightened. "Soldier," she said flatly. "Used to be," he replied. "Blue coat." He shook his head. "Gray." Something in her expression shifted, not anger but recognition. "Both colors burn," she murmured and closed her eyes. Silas felt that line land somewhere deep. Outside thunder rolled again, distant, now moving east. The air smelled of wet pine and ashes. He rose quietly, fetched his coat, and draped it over her feet. The gesture startled her eyes open again. She looked at him confused, then muttered something soft in Apache. He caught one word this time. "Thank you." He sat beside the hearth, arms around his knees, listening to the slow drip from the roof. The rain was no longer an enemy. It was a witness. Toward dawn, the fever broke. Her breathing deepened, her face smoothed. When the first gray light bled through the window, Silas stepped outside. The river had begun to fall back, carrying branches, debris, a broken saddle. He stared at it for a long time, the mist beating in his hair, the chill working through his bones. When he turned back, she was standing in the doorway, barefoot, wrapped in his blanket, face pale but unyielding. "You should rest," he said. She shook her head. "You saved me," she said slowly, "but saving isn't living." Her voice was rough, but there was fire in it. He didn't argue. They both knew truth when they heard it. She stepped forward until she stood beside him on the porch. Together they watched the river crawl away from the land it had tried to claim. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered, the smell of wet wood, the memory of water over skin, the ghost of fear. Silas looked at her profile in the dim light, the set of her jaw, the cut across her lip, the way her eyes followed the current, as if reading messages written in the foam. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then said, "Ayanna." He nodded. "Silas." The river kept whispering between them, not unkindly. Ayanna drew the blanket tighter, and turned toward the cabin. "Fire's dying," she said, her tone halfway between command and invitation. He followed her inside. By the time the sun climbed over the ridge, the rain had stopped. Smoke rose straight from the chimney. Inside, two strangers shared the warmth of the same flame, each trying not to remember that fire always needs both fuel and air to keep living. Silas watched her from across the room, how she fed the fire, how the light bent across her face, and he knew the storm outside was nothing compared to the one beginning inside him. Shelter by the river. By morning, the storm had collapsed into drizzle. The valley steamed under pale light, and the river ran thick as rust. Mist clung to the porch rails, blurring the line between sky and ground. The cabin stood like a survivor wood darkened roof, dripping smoke curling thin from the chimney. Inside, the air smelled of damp wool whiskey and something new life returning after too much noise. Silas stirred the fire back to strength the way a man tends memories slow cautious, not sure if it's worth the burn. He worked with the rhythm of someone long accustomed to silence. Each crack of wood, each hiss of sap was a heartbeat against the stillness. Behind him the woman slept. Her fever had broken near dawn, her breath steady and shallow. He could hear it between raindrops, that small proof that she hadn't drifted back into the dark river that had nearly claimed her. When he turned, she was awake. She watched him like a deer watches the edge of a rifle sound, still unreadable, ready to vanish. Her eyes were darker than the river, her hair a tangled weight over her shoulders. The blanket he'd wrapped her in had slipped, showing the line of her collarbone, pale against the fire's low gold. "You remember?" he asked, voice rough from hours of disuse. A pause, the sound of rain on the roof. Then a nod. She touched the bandage on her arm, traced the rawhide marks at her wrist, looked at him again. "You cut," she said slowly. "I did," he answered. "Seemed right." She blinked once, not in thanks exactly, but in recognition. That was enough. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was fragile, like a bridge still being built. The fire-cracked sighed and settled, filling the gaps between their words. When she tried to stand, he rose too. She lifted a hand, stopping him, pride steadier than her legs. She took 3 steps before her knees betrayed her. He caught her elbow firm, careful, the way you'd catch something breakable but defiant. She didn't pull away this time. He guided her to the stool near the hearth. "Food," he said simply. He ladled rabbit stew into a tin bowl, the last of his stores. The smell filled the cabin, salt sage smoke. She hesitated, suspicion flickering in her eyes, then took it. Each bite was slow, deliberate, as if testing whether the world still meant her harm. Rain pattered on the roof in gentle rhythm. "What name?" he asked. "Ayanna," she said, and the air seemed to listen. "Silas," he replied. She repeated it once, the syllables rolling uncertainly off her tongue. "Silas." He almost smiled. Almost. They sat a while in silence. Not the empty kind, but the kind that waits to see what will happen next. Outside, the river dragged branches and memory alike downstream. Inside, 2 strangers shared a single fire and the uneasy grace of survival. When she finished eating, Ayanna set the bowl aside and looked around the cabin. The place was spare, a rifle by the door, coffee tin, 1 coat, hung to dry, 2 mugs on a shelf. A life reduced to bone and breath. "You live alone," she said. "Easier that way. Not always." Her English was fractured, but her meaning wasn't. He looked at her and understood she wasn't talking about company. She was talking about endurance, the kind that outlasts everything except itself. The rain lightened until it was barely more than mist. Silas stepped outside to check the horse, while she stayed near the hearth, running her fingers over the woven blanket like it was a map of her own scars. He returned with mud on his boots and a faint limp in his left leg. She noticed, but didn't ask. "You were soldier," she said. It wasn't a question. "Was," he said. "Long time ago. War changes name. Never ends." Her tone made him glance at her sharply. The words sounded like something she'd learned from loss, not from books. The afternoon turned humid and gray. The cabin steamed the walls, breathing out the storm's memory. Silas climbed to the roof to re-nail a loose board while Ayanna swept the floor with a bundle of dried reeds. They moved without speaking yet, their motions found rhythm, two exiles performing small acts of repair. When thunder rolled faint and far, both paused. He looked at the clouds, she at the door. Neither flinched. It wasn't fear anymore. It was recognition, the way veterans of the same battle can sense the echo without needing to name it. By dusk, the rain had thinned to silver threads. The world smelled of moss and ash. Ayanna stood at the open door, watching the river calm. Its surface glowed copper in the dying light, the current thick, but no longer angry. Her hair, still damp, caught the firelight like strands of smoke. Silas joined her. For a while neither spoke. The sound of the river filled the space between them. "Your people?" he asked. She shook her head. "Far. Maybe gone." He nodded. "Then we wait for the ground to dry. After that, we'll see." She looked at him, eyes reflecting the dim glow of the fire inside. "You help," she said quietly. "Why?" He took his time answering. The rain's last drop fell from the porch beam before he spoke. "Because I couldn't save the last ones." Her gaze didn't soften, but something in it changed, like she'd recognized the shape of his sorrow. She reached for the doorframe, laid her palm flat against the wood, half blessing, half boundary. The firelight spilled over them, soft and gold like mercy finding its way through ruin. Later, when night came full and the mist thickened, Silas added more wood to the hearth. Ayanna lay rolled in blankets, half asleep, her breathing even. Outside, frogs began to call from the flooded reeds, the first music after chaos. He sat near the fire, elbows on his knees, watching the flames dance. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like the last man left alive. Ayanna stirred. "You keep watch, Habit," he said. She turned her head, eyes catching the light. "You think Storm come back? Storms always come back," he said. "Just never the same one." Her lips curved faintly, something close to a smile, brief as a spark. "Then we live between them," he nodded. "If we can." When she closed her eyes again, he looked toward the river through the open door. The water glinted with moonlight, restless but alive. He realized the land was breathing again, and somehow so was he. Near midnight, a branch cracked somewhere upriver. Silas reached for his rifle, every nerve awake. Ayanna stirred, but didn't sit up. "Animal," she murmured, half dream, half certainty. He waited, listening. Nothing followed, only the river's endless talk. When he finally set the rifle down, he found her watching him, awake after all. "You trust no one," she said softly. He met her eyes. "I learned to stay alive that way. Maybe now you learn something else." He didn't ask what. She drifted back to sleep, her face turned toward the fire, and he stayed there until the coals dimmed her words, echoing like a seed trying to root. By dawn, the mist had lifted. The valley shimmered in pale gold. Steam rose from the ground where the flood had touched, curling like smoke from cooling embers. The river moved slower, now carrying silt and sunlight. Silas stepped outside. The air tasted of pine and wet stone. The world felt washed clean, even if neither of them was. Behind him, Ayanna stood in the doorway, wrapped in his old blanket. She looked out at the land with a wary calm of someone who had lost everything and still chose to see beauty. He said quietly, "When the road clears, I'll take you west. There's a trading post, 2 days' ride. You'll find help there." She tilted her head. "You send me away. It's safer." She studied him a long time. "Safe," she repeated, as if testing the word. Then, with a small shake of her head, "Safe is not same as alive." He looked away, unable to argue. The sun broke through the last veil of cloud, setting the river aflame. For a moment the whole valley glowed, water, mud, smoke, all turning to gold. Ayanna stepped down from the porch, bare feet, sinking into the wet earth. She crouched and touched the soil, smearing it across her palm like war paint. "Earth remembers," she said softly. "Even after flood." Silas watched her, and something inside him loosened the tightness that had held since the war, since Mary's death, since he'd chosen silence over guilt. He joined her by the riverbank. Together they stood in the thin light, the storm behind them, the current before them. Neither spoke. There was no need. The land had survived. So had they. And for now, that was enough. After the storm, 3 days passed before the river remembered calm. The sun returned shyly, thin light, sliding across wet ground, like someone afraid to disturb the wounded. Every puddle mirrored a piece of the sky. Every branch dripped in slow rhythm, and the air smelled of cedar mud and clean beginnings. Silas stepped outside with an axe over his shoulder. The storm had left the valley scattered, and strange trees, uprooted fence posts, drowned in silt, his small footbridge carried off like it had never mattered. But the cabins still stood. So did they. Ayanna followed him into the open barefoot, her borrowed coat tied at the waist with a strip of leather. The ground squelched beneath her steps. Mist hung low over the field ghosts of the storm, unwilling to leave just yet. She stared at the swollen river, brown and wide its surface, dragging sunlight into ripples of dull gold. "Water angry," she said finally. "It was," he answered. "Not today." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing, as if listening beyond the surface. "Water remembers." He didn't know what to say to that, so he started cutting wood. The rhythm steadied him, swing, breath, crack, the sound of work, clean and honest. Ayanna crouched nearby, gathering the smaller branches, stacking them neatly beside him. Her movements were efficient, quiet, every gesture shaped by habit. The silence between them wasn't empty now, it had purpose, shared weight. By mid-morning the clouds thinned. Sunlight broke through in pale stripes, laying gold on the wet earth. The steam rising from the ground smelled like iron and pine sap. Silas paused to wipe his brow. The shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat and the faint spray of the river. Ayanna filled buckets from the side creek that had broken off the main flow, the one that still whispered along the edge of the property. She carried them carefully balanced against her hip. When she handed him one, their fingers brushed. A small, accidental thing, but the world seemed to hold its breath. He looked up. Her gaze met his, steady, unreadable. Then she turned away, kneeling to rinse the mud from her hands. The moment passed, but it left a trace behind, like warmth, lingering after lightning. By noon they began repairing the bridge. The storm had torn the old one apart, scattering planks downstream. They salvaged what they could, carrying new beams from the shed, sawing them to fit. Silas showed her how to brace the frame with crossbeams. She showed him where the current ran shallowest, where the footing held. Words were few, gestures sure. Sweat and sawdust hands scraped raw the day, pulling them into the same rhythm. When the last plank settled into place, she stood beside him and nodded once. "Good," she said. He glanced at the sky, blue, stretched clean again, clouds drifting lazy and white. "Good," he echoed. The river beneath them murmured in agreement. They walked back to the cabin together, the air carrying that peculiar quiet that follows hard work, the silence that feels earned. That evening they cooked what little game he'd caught, a pair of trout, silver and clean. Ayanna gutted them deftly, sprinkling crushed sage and wild onion over the meat before laying them across the coals. The smell rose sharp and earthy. Smoke twisted upward through the roof gap, curling into the soft dusk. Silas sat by the fire watching her movements. She used her hands like someone accustomed to making do, with patience, not rush. Her face, lit by flame, looked younger than before, though the scars at her wrists never disappeared in shadow. When they ate, the food was plain but good. He hadn't shared a meal with another soul in years. The sound of her breathing beside the fire unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. He realized how much silence could hurt when it wasn't chosen. After they ate, Ayanna hummed low, steady, the sound of water rolling over stone. No words, just breath shaped into memory. The melody wound through the cabin, slipping under the door out to the river beyond. It made the night seem less empty. "You sing for the storm?" he asked quietly. She shook her head. "For the living." He stared into the fire until the flames blurred. "Haven't heard a song in a long time." "Then you forget," she said simply. "Song keeps heart warm." He looked at her, at the calm, deliberate way she sat cross-legged on the floor, the faint shimmer of firelight in her eyes. "Guess I could use reminding," he said. For a while they just listened to the river, to the wind combing through half-fallen branches, to their own quiet breathing. The night wrapped around them soft and slow. Ayanna reached into the small pouch tied at her belt and pulled out a single red willow leaf, torn and dried by the storm. She placed it by the edge of the fire. For the river, she said. Silas hesitated, then fished in his pocket and pulled out a spent cartridge, the brass dulled by rain. He tossed it beside the leaf, for what it took. Neither explained. They didn't need to. The meaning hung there simple as smoke. The fire popped sparks, darting up through the chimney gap, bright, brief lives rising into the dark. Outside the river ran quiet. Its rage spent its voice, low and forgiving. Somewhere down its length a heron cried the sound long and lonely. Ayanna leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed. The glow from the embers painted her face in copper tones. Storm change river, she said, also change people. Maybe, Silas murmured, if they let it. She looked at him then, not as a stranger but as someone who might understand. You let it. He didn't answer right away. His hand rested on the rifle by his knee fingers tracing the worn metal. Still trying, he said at last. The words hung between them soft as confession. Ayanna smiled faintly, just a shadow of it, but it was enough to turn the space between them warm. When the fire sank low, she rose, crossed to the door, and stepped outside. The night air shimmered cool against her skin. The river reflected the moon in broken pieces. She whispered something in her language too quiet for him to catch, and knelt, touching the damp ground with her fingertips. Silas watched from the doorway. Praying, he asked. Listening, she said, without turning, to what water keeps. He didn't press. Some things weren't meant for translation. When she came back inside, her hair was wet with mist. She sat again by the fire, closer this time. The quiet that followed wasn't cautious anymore. It was companionable, like a blanket pulled over two weary bodies. Silas leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. The crackle of the coals, the rhythm of the river, her steady breathing, these sounds wove together into something he hadn't felt in years. Peace thin and temporary but real. He must have drifted because when he opened his eyes again, dawn was pressing pale light through the window. Ayanna was asleep beside the firehead resting on her arm. The red willow leaf and his spent cartridge still lay together in the ash, one born from earth, the other from iron. Opposite ends of the same story. He stood quietly, stepped outside, and looked toward the river. The world was washed new green, returning along the banks. The bridge they'd built held firm against the current. When he came back, Ayanna was awake. She looked at the fire's dying coals, then at him. You go today. Not yet, he said. The trail's still soft. Maybe trail not only in dirt, she said, watching him closely. Sometimes here. She pressed her hand against her chest. Silas looked away, throat tight. You talk like a preacher. She smiled. Like woman who drown and wake again. He had no answer for that. They ate breakfast in silence, cold trout and black coffee. When she stepped outside, the sun caught the edges of her hair, and for a moment he saw her as she might have been before everything went wrong. Wild, fierce, alive. He found himself smiling before he realized it. The river whispered its slow song below the ridge. The land had healed enough to breathe again, and as they stood side by side at the water's edge, Silas thought not for the first time that maybe the flood had brought her to him for a reason neither of them yet understood. The storm had ended, but its echo lingered in them, both reshaping what they thought they knew about ruin and repair. That night, when the fire burned low again, Ayanna began to hum the same tune as before, soft, persistent, as if calling back the parts of the world that had gone missing. Silas listened, eyes half closed, and for the first time in years didn't flinch at the sound of memory. Outside the river ran calm, the moon laying a silver path across its back, and inside the cabin 2 survivors sat close enough for warmth, their shadows crossing on the wall, the distance between them smaller than the night before. When the past rode back, by the 5th morning, the world had dried enough to crack. The grass still shone with dew, but the mud along the riverbank had hardened into crust. Silas woke early, sensing a change that had nothing to do with weather. The birds were quiet. Even the wind had taken cover. He saddled his mare, planning to ride toward the ridge for supplies. Ayanna stood by the doorway, hair braided back, eyes following the river's curve. Storm sleeps, she said. Maybe too quiet, he muttered. She looked at him, then toward the horizon. Quiet is before trouble. He almost smiled. You've lived out here long enough. Her reply was simple, long enough to know men ride after silence. By midday she was right. The first sign came as dust, 3 thin plumes rising from the southern road. Silas froze hand, tightening on the reins. Through his field-glass figures took shape 4 riders, one coat he recognized even at distance. Cavalry blue stripped of insignia. Pettigrew. Memories returned like lightning. Gunfire orders barked across smoke, the sound of men dying for words they didn't believe. Cyrus Pettigrew had been his superior once. Now he was a merchant of flesh, feeding the frontier's ugliest hunger. Ayanna saw the look on Silas's face and went still. Men, yes, he said. The kind we don't want to meet. They packed in silence rifle ammunition, a few strips of dried meat. She helped without question. When he slung the saddlebag over his shoulder, she stopped him with a touch on the arm. No run, she said. Fight. He met her eyes steady, certain, like the river after flood. If it comes to that, it came sooner than he hoped. By dusk, the riders reached the valley. Pettigrew's voice carried across the clearing, smooth as old whiskey. Walker thought you were ghost by now. Silas stepped out of the cabin, Winchester in hand. You should have kept riding, Cyrus. Now that wouldn't be neighborly. Heard tell you're harboring property that belongs to me. She's not property. Everything out here's property, Pettigrew said, smile thin as wire. Land, horsewoman, it's all trade if you're hungry enough. Behind, Silas Ayanna appeared in the doorway, holding his Colt steady, both hands firm. Her face was calm, unreadable. The sight of her drew Pettigrew's smirk wider. Still alive, are you? Thought the river took you. She tried, Ayanna answered. But water kinder than men. The other men laughed uneasy. Pettigrew didn't. Step aside, Walker. You got no dog in this fight. Silas raised the rifle. Maybe I just got tired of watching you poison the ground. The standoff hung in the hot air, the smell of rain still trapped in the soil. Ayanna moved first, firing once clean. The bullet took the man on Pettigrew's left, spun him off his horse. Chaos followed, gunfire, shouts, hooves tearing mud. Silas dropped one more before a round grazed his shoulder, heat searing through cloth. Pettigrew's horse reared his shot, going wild. Then Ayanna was there beside Silas, calm as storm's eye, reloading with quick, sure hands. When the smoke cleared, only Pettigrew remained upright. He spat blood, staggered toward the riverbank. You think this changes a damn thing, he rasped. Frontier don't forgive. Silas followed, rifle lowered. Neither do I. Pettigrew lunged for his revolver. One shot cracked. Echo rolled down the valley. Pettigrew fell backward into the water that had brought her here, the current taking him downstream without ceremony. The silence after was vast. Ayanna stood beside Silas' chest, heaving rain beginning again in thin threads from a gray sky. She watched the ripples fade. Water remembers, she said. He nodded, feeling blood soak through his sleeve, unsure if it was his or the earth's, and maybe forgives. They turned back toward the cabin, neither speaking. The rain fell soft, steady, washing the powder smoke from their hands. The crossing morning rose slow and gray, as if the sky itself mourned the night before. The rain had passed, leaving only mist curling through the trees. The river ran heavy and brown again, swollen with what it had claimed. Silas stood on the porch, bandage fresh on his shoulder, watching the current. Every time the water bent around the rocks, it whispered Pettigrew's name, and then swallowed it. Behind him, Ayanna packed the small bundle she'd kept ready from the start, dried meat. A blanket, one red willow leaf tucked safe inside. He knew what that meant. She came out quietly, boots sinking into the wet earth. River high, she said. It'll fall in a day or two. I cannot wait. My son, he waits longer. Silas nodded. He'd known since the gunfire faded that she wouldn't stay. You could save a life but not keep it. I can ride with you part way, he said. She shook her head. No, you bleed. And they will look for you too. He looked down at his hands, still stained faintly red despite the rain. Maybe that's fair. For a long moment, they just listened to the water. The rebuilt bridge stood narrow and fragile, their joint labor now a line between worlds. Ayanna stepped closer, gaze steady. You gave me breath, she said. Now I must give it back. He tried to smile. Just promise you'll cross careful. She reached up, touched his face, fingers tracing the scar that time had forgotten to heal. "I remember this," she whispered. "Not for hurt, for truth." He caught her wrist, held it a second longer than he should. "You know how to find me." "The river knows," she said. She walked to the bridge. The boards creaked beneath her, water foaming below. Halfway across, she turned. The mist drifted between them, thin as breath. "Silas Walker," she called, voice carrying over the water. "You are not alone." Then she was gone into the trees, a dark shape swallowed by rainlight. Silas stayed where he was until his knees trembled. The quiet pressed close. No wind, no birds, just the river moving on. He went to the edge, touched the railing they'd built together. A single red willow leaf floated past, turning slow in the current. He followed it with his eyes until it vanished. The sun broke then, thin but real, warming the scars on his hands. He whispered into the air, "Ride safe, river woman." Behind him the cabin waited, half shadow, half hope. He turned back inside, knowing the storm had taken much, but left enough to begin again. Red Willow Dawn Spring came shyly to Red Willow Valley like a woman unsure she was still welcome. The snowline on the distant ridge melted into threads of water that fed the river, softening its voice. Grass pushed through old mud, and the air smelled of smoke and lilac. The world had survived its own drowning. Silas mended the fence one post at a time. His shoulder healed crooked, but he didn't mind. Each swing of the hammer was a kind of prayer, each breath a small apology to the land. The cabin had dried the roof, patched the bridge standing firm. He hadn't spoken her name in months, but he heard it each time the wind touched the river Ayana. Sometimes he'd see a leaf swirl against the current and imagine it was a message she sent the river, carrying her words home. That morning the mare lifted her head and snorted. Silas followed her gaze. A rider crested the hill beyond the cottonwood, sun at her back. For a moment he thought it was a trick of light, the river playing games again, but then the figure dismounted and his breath caught. Ayana. She walked toward him through the pale mist coat, unbuttoned hair long and free. The years between storms had done nothing but make her more real. Behind her, tied to the saddle, hung a bundle small, careful, a child's blanket. Silas set down the hammer, afraid that any sudden move might wake him from this. She stopped a few feet away. "My son's safe," she said softly. "He lives with my people south. He learns to ride, to sing." He nodded, unable to trust his own voice. "I stayed 6 moons," she continued, "but my heart, not there." Her hand came to her chest, fingers pressed flat. "My heart stayed by the river." He stepped closer, slow as dawn spreading over the valley. "If you still want to stay," he said, "there's room." Her eyes filled with light, not tears, but something older. "Then I stay." They moved without need for words. He reached for her. She met him halfway. The embrace was not fevered, not desperate, just quiet, whole. The kind of silence that holds rather than hides. Later, when the sun lifted over the ridge, they walked together to the riverbank. The water ran clear, now reflecting the sky in soft blue ripples. Silas carried a spade. Ayana, a sapling red willow she'd brought wrapped in cloth. He dug the hole while she knelt in the wet soil, her hands moving with reverence. They planted it just above the high water mark, where floods might test it but never take it. "Grow strong," she murmured in Apache. "Remember both storm and calm." Silas poured the last of his morning coffee over the roots. "For the river that brought you," he said. They stood side by side, watching the wind catch the sapling's leaves. The branches swayed and whispered like a voice they both knew. Ayana slipped her hand into his. "Now," she said, "we belong." He nodded. "To each other, also to the land," she added, smiling. The sun burned the mist away, gold spilling across water across them. The valley breathed again. Somewhere upstream, the river curved out of sight, still carrying everything they'd lost, everything they'd found. "Silas," whispered Red Willow, "remembers." And beside him, Ayana closed her eyes, listening to water, to wind, to the quiet that finally felt like peace.